Yo, what is up guys? Delboy here, aka Blue Collar Sports TV. Hopefully you guys are doing well. If you're new here, smash that like, hit subscribe, all of that good stuff. So this video is a quick preview and prediction for Zach Parker versus John Ryder. Now this fight goes down this weekend actually at the O2 Arena in London. Takes place on BT Sports in the UK. And yeah, I think this is a really intriguing domestic matchup. And by the way, the WBO interim super middleweight title will also be on the line here. But when you look at this fight, I kind of see it as a crossroads fight. And what I mean by that is Zach Parker going into this fight is the up-and-comer, I would say. He is somewhat unproven, but he's got a flashy record, unbeaten. And he's shown, I would say, a lot of promise in his career to date. And there's a lot of high hopes on the shoulders of Zach Parker. Whereas John Ryder is the stalwart here. He's the experienced guy who's been around a long time. He's been there or thereabouts, but he's never really got over the hurdle. Arguably he beat Callum Smith and he should have been a world champion. But regardless of that, John Ryder hasn't really been able to jump that final hurdle. And you sense for John Ryder that basically it's winner stays on. I think if he loses this fight, more than likely he retires. I mean, he said something similar before the Danny Jacobs fight. So I think he's only really sticking around to potentially get a title shot. Or who knows, should he win the interim title, maybe he's elevated to world champion. You never know in regards to boxing politics. But yeah, I tend to think that John Ryder's not going to be willing to stick around should he lose this fight. So there's a lot on the line for John Ryder in my mind. And as for Zach Parker, he's had the build-up in recent times since he signed with Frank Warren. Frank Warren has, showcased him on several BT cards. Zach Parker's done the business by scoring knockouts. And he's got an elevated ranking, let's be honest, for beating nobody. And this is the acid test, If he loses this fight, it's back to domestic level for Zach Parker. So both guys have a lot on the line here. And with that in mind, I think it makes it an interesting fight, an intriguing fight. And on top of that, the stylistic matchup itself is interesting to me as well. But nevertheless, let's briefly break down the tale of the tape. And after that, I shall just briefly explain what I believe each guy should do to stand a chance of winning this fight. And at the end, I will make my official prediction. And right now, I'm still umming and ahhing in regards to who I'm going to pick. I see this one as a pretty much close to a 50-50 fight, quite frankly. But regardless, let's go through the tale of the tape. And we shall start with Zach Parker. Zach Parker has a perfect record of 22-0, 16 of his 22 wins coming by way of knockout, whereas John Ryder has a record of 31 wins, 5 defeats, 17 of his 31 wins coming by way of knockout. So as you can see by the amount of fights, John Ryder has a boatload more experience, and it's not just that he's fought more, he's fought much better competition. John Ryder, he's been in there with the likes of Daniel Jacobs, Callum Smith, Billy Joe Saunders, etc. So, John Ryder's fought good guys in his career, whereas Zach Parker's not really fought anybody at that level. Zach Parker is listed as 6 foot with a 74-inch reach, whereas John Ryder is listed as 5'9" with a 72-inch reach. So Zach Parker is the taller, longer man. He's got 3 inches in height, and also he's got a 2-inch reach advantage. And given his style, that could play a big factor in this fight. Given both guys' styles, to be honest, Zach Parker is more of a sharpshooter from the outside, and John Ryder likes to get up close or at mid-range. That's where he does his best work. So the reach in this fight could be very important for Zach Parker. Obviously, Zach Parker is an orthodox fighter, whereas John Ryder is a southpaw. Who knows, maybe the southpaw factor is an advantage for John Ryder. Zach Parker is 28 years old, whereas John Ryder is 34 years old. So, Zach Parker obviously is the fresher guy, albeit less experienced. Now the tale of the tape is out of the way, I'll briefly break down what I believe each guy should do to win this fight. For Zach Parker, to me at least, it's quite obvious to what he should do in this fight. When I see Zach Parker fight, I would describe his style as that of a boxer-puncher. He's long and rangy, and he likes to get behind that jab, follow through with that straight right hand, and he can put some good power on those straight punches. In this fight against John Ryder, particularly early on, I think Zach Parker should concentrate more on being fleet of foot. Try to keep John Ryder at arm's length and box off that back foot early on in this bout. One thing about John Ryder tends to start fights relatively slowly. Sometimes he takes a few rounds to get warmed up. If I'm Zach Parker, I would try to take advantage of that right away and essentially steal the early rounds by keeping it long, keeping it straight, and boxing off that back foot. We saw Danny Jacobs actually give John Ryder some issues when he was backpedaling. John Ryder wasn't cutting the ring off quickly enough, as far as I'm concerned, and he couldn't really make that distance up in numerous rounds of their fight. Given the height and reach advantage of Zach Parker, I think Zach Parker should adopt something similar. Keep it long, keep it straight, but keep it on the back foot. Don't become too involved early on, because John Ryder has underrated defense, I would say. He's really good at catching and countering, and he's really good at those subtle slips, especially when it comes to straight punches. He can slip, and one shot in particular that's really effective from John Ryder is like it's almost like a counter up jab. It's a really good shot, and he was catching Callum Smith with that shot all night long. Callum Smith would fall in, and John Ryder would catch him with that up jab. So, and also not only that, John Ryder has a really good southpaw right hook, which again can be used for countering. And I think Zach Parker early on in this fight needs to avoid sitting on his punches in case he falls in against John Ryder while Ryder is fresh and still powerful. He needs to avoid falling in, because if he gets caught, John Ryder has deceptive power. When you look at John Ryder, I don't think puncher is the first thing that comes to mind. But listen, man, he got Callum Smith's respect, no doubt about it. At times he was getting Danny Jacobs' respect later on in their fight. John Ryder hits hard enough, in my opinion, and you don't want to be giving him free shots and falling in and giving him counterpunch opportunities. So early on in this fight, if I'm Zach Parker, I try to box, keep it long, and make John Ryder try to chase the fight and try to steal those early rounds. I just think using that boxer-puncher style early on might be a little bit risky for Zach Parker, because not only that, John Ryder has a really good guard, and he's got underrated defense in general. So if Zach Parker is utilizing that boxer-puncher style straight away, and he's making mistakes as a result, John Ryder's going to counter, have success of his own, and he's going to be well in that fight, in terms of winning rounds. But however, if Zach Parker boxes early and steals those rounds from distance, I think at that point, as this fight progresses, John Ryder will start to take more risks, as he did in the Danny Jacobs fight. If you look at that fight, John Ryder had much more success in the second half as he opened up. However, I felt defensively he was leaving more gaps. For whatever reason, Danny Jacobs never took advantage of that, but maybe a quick-handed guy who's accurate and who can deliver straight punches can take advantage of those defensive flaws when John Ryder starts to get a little more desperate in an attempt to close the distance and get close. So what I would say is I would box early on and then adapt the style to a more counter-punching / boxer-punching type of style. One shot in particular that could be really effective for Zach Parker would be the uppercut. Zach Parker's got a good left and right uppercut, and he could try to utilise that shot as the fight plays out, as it gets a bit later in the fight, as a counterpunch. John Ryder, sometimes he does have a tendency to sometimes walk in straight lines. He's got a crouched type of style where he's leaning forwards, and sometimes John Ryder doesn't always take his head off centre line. So maybe try to draw the lead of John Ryder, throw a fake jab, draw the lead of John Ryder, make John Ryder overextend or come in, and try to land one of those uppercuts on John Ryder to break through the guard. Zach Parker does have really good uppercuts. The only thing I would say, don't spend too much time in the pocket. I believe John Ryder is certainly more skilled on the inside, not only in regards to punch selection, but also in regards to defense. One thing about Zach Parker on the inside that I've noticed, he leaves a lot of body to be aimed at, and you can see that in his fights with Darryl Williamson. I know he was injured in that fight, but you can also see it in the Rohan Murdoch fight. So, listen, try to land the odd counter uppercut, try and draw John Ryder in. Once you land that shot, get out. Don't let John Ryder work on the inside, because he is the more skilled inside fighter, in my opinion. And one more thing, one little thing I would say from Zach Parker from a defensive standpoint. Zach Parker does sometimes fight out of a high guard, but he does have a tendency to keep his lead hand, his left hand, a little bit lower. Against a guy like John Ryder, who's a southpaw, who's got a really good lead right uppercut, he needs to keep that left hand glued to his chin, because the southpaw right uppercut, from what I've seen, is open against Zach Parker from the fights I've seen. So I think they need to tighten that up defensively from the side of Zach Parker. But ultimately, if I'm training Zach Parker, I would tell him to box early on, don't take unnecessary risks, and as the fight progresses, providing that you win the early rounds, then essentially try to utilize John Ryder's momentum and offense against him as he gets more desperate, turn into the counterpuncher and try to walk John Ryder onto big shots, big straight right hands, big uppercuts, and try to hook around the guard also. In regards to John Ryder, in this fight, one thing I'll say right from the get-go, I want to see John Ryder fight this fight with a higher punch output. If we look back to the Danny Jacobs fight, one thing I didn't like about Ryder's performance, to me it took him far too long to get going, and in general, at times he just wasn't throwing enough punches. Even when he had Danny Jacobs in position to punch, he wasn't always letting his hands go. Maybe that was because of the speed of Danny Jacobs, potentially, but he needs to be a lot more active in this fight. I think he needs to try and lull Zach Parker into a bit of a war, a fight that is up close and also at mid-range. I think that's where John Ryder will do his best work in this fight. So yeah, a higher punch output from John Ryder, I would say, is required, and he needs to try and quicken those feet up and more effectively close the distance. One thing I like about John Ryder, he always displays good defense while coming forwards. He's got a really good guard, and occasionally he does move his head, but he does need to do it more consistently in this fight against a good straight puncher like Zach Parker. Again, I have said, yeah, John Ryder can move his head, but sometimes he'll come in straight lines, head over his kind of lead knee, and head is right on centre line. And against a straight puncher, that's not always ideal, especially when he can throw a lead uppercut. So I want to see more head movement from John Ryder. I want to see him maintain that guard that he always has, but he needs to be punching on the front foot. John Ryder has a brilliant step-in jab, I would call it, where he'll step in and jab at the same time. It's a brilliant shot from John Ryder. We saw it quite regularly against Callum Smith, but for whatever reason, John Ryder doesn't utilise that punch enough. It's really effective at number one, closing the distance, but also befuddling his opponent. So when he gets there, he's open to throw some combinations and throw some shots because they're not braced for them. They're not in a position to defend themselves as well because their construct has been broken by that step-in jab. So I want to see more of that front foot jab in this fight by John Ryder. It's a really good shot when he uses it. He doesn't use it enough. And this is the thing with John Ryder. John Ryder has a lot of skill, a lot of subtle skill and effective tricks, but he never puts it all together to have a complete performance, if that makes sense. The only exception being at elite level was Callum Smith. I felt he got robbed in that fight. But yeah, more consistency from John Ryder across the board, I would say. And yeah, he needs to quicken up his feet, jab his way in, hard jab on his way in, and throw when he closes that distance. There were far too many times against Danny Jacobs where he would close the distance. Danny Jacobs often would have his back to the ropes, but he wasn't throwing enough. He would let Danny Jacobs escape. There can't be any of that in this fight. He needs to put it on the inexperienced Zach Parker. He needs to try and test that body, test his will, etc. And again, bear in mind, John Ryder here is the away fighter. Frank Warren is Zach Parker's promoter. It's a Frank Warren show. John Ryder is the outsider, so that rhymed. But yeah, John Ryder needs to take more initiative in this fight. Not only that, he needs to take more risks, in my opinion. Obviously, he needs to do what he does well, which is coming forwards behind the high guard, ramrod jab, do that, cool. But he needs to mix things up. I want to see John Ryder lead with that southpaw right hook, change things up, you know. I want to see him be more offensive on the front foot. I want to see him throwing more punches on the front foot in general, not just waiting until Zach Parker is stationary. When you're stationary, that is when John Ryder can really go through the gears and land some really good short combinations up close. But I think John Ryder is going to need to be punching on the front foot in this fight. John Ryder can do it, he just doesn't do it enough. In fact, it's funny, I actually think John Ryder should probably study someone like Alexander Povetkin going into this fight. I know Povetkin is an orthodox fighter, but they actually fight in a somewhat similar style. Not completely similar, but somewhat similar. You know, he needs to see how Povetkin not only would close that distance with the jab, but also, you know, look at how he would explode with that leaping left hook. How he would lead at times with his straight right hand. These sort of things, you know, to give Zach Parker something different to think about. And naturally, when John Ryder does have Zach Parker against the ropes, or when Zach Parker is holding his feet, John Ryder needs to be working that body for one, and number two is paramount. That right uppercut of John Ryder could be money against Zach Parker because, again, the right uppercut to body or head, Zach Parker offers a lot of space through the middle when he's in the pocket. Look at his hand position, look at his head position when he fights on the inside. He's open for the uppercut to body and head. One thing about John Ryder, he's extremely good at creating space for himself on the inside. He needs to be looking for that shot. Right uppercut to body and head, as well as obviously hooks and maintaining a good work rate, things of that nature. And like I was saying in regards to Parker, he's got a tendency to hold that lead hand a little too low at times. So John Ryder naturally needs to be looking for that right hook, not only to try and lead with it and be offensive with it, but also to try and counter that jab of Zach Parker. Slip a jab. You know, John Ryder's got really good lead hand control. He throws really good feints as well from his lead hand. Try and draw that jab, catch it on the gloves, take a little dip, take a little slip, and then try to counter that jab as Zach Parker is bringing it back to his chin, because it doesn't always go back to his chin. Sometimes it will go just below it. So try to counter that jab of Zach Parker as well as leading with that right hook. And yeah, for John Ryder, for me, he needs to let it all hang out here. We know John Ryder's got skill. We know he's got ability. We know he's got fundamentals. He's got good balance, great punch selection, but needs to be a lot more intensity in this fight, in my opinion. And yeah, I mean, with all of that being said, I mean, I'm still really struggling to call this fight. I'm not saying this as a cop-out. I can genuinely see this fight going either way in terms of who wins. One result I would be surprised at is if John Ryder wins on points, given that he's fighting away from home, and given the fact that sometimes, you know, John Ryder doesn't always start the quickest, but I think he's got a chance of knocking out Zach Parker. But I think Zach Parker may be a little fresher. Well, he is a little fresher. He's a better boxer from distance, from the outside. He's got hometown favoritism on his side. And I think that John Ryder's tendency to start slow at times may resurface in this fight. I can see a scenario where Zach Parker does win the early rounds, and I can see a scenario where this fight starts out relatively nondescript. I think this fight basically is going to be a slow burn. Zach Parker wins the early rounds by boxing. John Ryder inches his way and starts to drag his way back into the fight, has more success up close. Maybe Zach Parker starts to gas as this fight goes down the stretch. I can see this fight going one of two ways. John Ryder stops him late, and you know, the inexperience of Zach Parker shows itself. Maybe he's exposed as a pretender, or Zach Parker remains strong, he continues behind that jab, and he picks the cleaner straight punches, and he wins on points. And I'm going for the latter. I have Zach Parker on points in this fight, but I'm not confident. And yeah, the fact this prediction video is 20 minutes long has even surprised me, quite frankly. But it's a really good fight. I'm actually really looking forward to this fight. There's not enough of these sort of domestic matchups right now, where both guys are at a similar level, or it's a crossroads fight like this, where one guy's the up-and-comer, the other guy's been in and around it for a long while. It's a great fight. I am favouring Zach Parker on points, but it can go either way in my opinion. I could even see Zach Parker catching John Ryder with something big. I think Zach Parker's power is relatively real. How real? Who knows? If he goes in there and blasts out John Ryder, that's a hell of a statement. But yeah, great fight. Looking forward to it. Share your predictions below. It's been your guy Delboy. Peace.